Two engines on the prison barge Purgatory broke down somewhere in the middle of uncharted regions. They were probably beyond repair. The prison moon had 7 days left to reach its destination. The navigation computer detected an Imperial ship, a drifting star destroyer, in the same system. But it hadn't made contact. If the bioscanners were to be believed, there were only a handful of survivors on board, 10 or 12 people, though at that time a star destroyer's crew could have numbered in the tens of thousands. An examination of the internal atmosphere revealed no known toxins or contaminants. The barge, which still had working engines, was scheduled to approach and dock with the star destroyer in an hour. A scouting party of guards, stormtroopers, and a few mechanical engineers would scout the situation and remove equipment to repair and replace the barge's engines from the star destroyer. The squad split into two groups. The first group was in a hangar among Imperial TIE fighters, transport shuttles, and other ships. They saw something. The troopers grabbed their phasers. Squad leader Sartoris squinted and saw silhouettes. There were several of them, hunched over with flat, angular limbs. They made the familiar whirring sound of servos, accompanied by a constant up and down motion. The captain exhaled. They were forklift droids. One stepped into the light. It looked boredly at the squad, then turned and staggered toward the stack of crates. As they moved through the ship's corridors, they encountered all sorts of janitorial droids, maintenance droids, and other droids. The endless corridors of the 1,600-meter giant were empty. There was only silence, stillness and emptiness, creaking softly in the darkness of space. The communication session with the second group failed. Not a single word was heard, and the voice was lost in a foamy wave of white noise. Something on the destroyer was causing interference. One of the enlisted men, his name was Armitage Hux, was an artist, but his talent was wasted in the penitentiary. His co-workers only asked him to draw naked women, or worse, speeders, and he hated drawing cars. But when he saw what was in the destroyer's biolab, he started sketching. The first thing Armitage noticed when he entered the hatch was the tank. In a way, it was the only thing he saw because he couldn't look at anything else after that. The contents of the tank were too overwhelming, too unfamiliar, and too beautiful to pass up. The tank itself was huge, the size of a wall, and filled with some sort of clear, bubbling gel. Inside the tank were dozens of incomprehensible pink organisms suspended by wires and tubes that connected to instruments standing beside it. Armitage could only stare in surprise. He froze. The pink things looked like unseen hybrids of flowers, peeled fruit, and winged animal embryos. It was like a flock of little naked angels. Then he stepped closer and realized what he was looking at. They were human lungs. If Armitage felt disgust, it came over him so quickly that he barely noticed. A deep and overwhelming sense of artistic allure replaced the disgust. In each tank, parts of the respiratory tract had been carefully separated to preserve the trachea, pharynx, and delicate organs of the voice box. Oxygen was pumped through tubes into the lungs, causing the organs to swell and contract in the liquid medium. Armitage noticed that all the lungs were breathing. He began to counted 33 pairs of lungs in the tank, but then lost count and stopped. Each pair of lungs was marked with a number and date. Apparently, they were preparations for abandoned scientific experiments whose purpose he could only guess at. Some of the lungs were different from the others. Their pink surface was gray in places, and a thick gray scar stood out on the muscular wall. Armitage stepped closer. He had almost forgotten the time and stared even more intently. Were his lungs breathing even faster, or was his imagination playing tricks on him? He was breathing with them. He stood as if hypnotized by the measured rhythm of their movements. As always, when he stumbled upon something amazing, his first inclination was to sketch it, to capture what he saw. Lung bathtub is not a bad name for a painting, he thought. How many emotions he felt when he saw it. There was awe, shock, and finally something familiar, as if he had seen it all before in a dream. Armitage watched the lungs take in oxygen through the tubes and noticed that they were breathing faster and deeper. Somewhere on the other side of the tank, a machine beeped, then beeped again. Looking closer, Armitage noticed several rubber tubes coming straight out of his lungs. They seemed to be pumping some kind of thick gray liquid into black cylinders at the far end of the lab. The lungs expanded and contracted, expanding and contracting faster and faster. Suddenly at the very top they stopped, and all of them, as one, screamed through the tubes. It was a high, buzzing scream, the note rising and then dropping sharply. Armitage recoiled from the volume of the scream, the like of which he had never heard in his life. He clutched his ears and squeezed his head, not wanting to stay in this place a second longer. His earpiece crackled. Some guard was trying to contact Armitage, but he could barely explain what had happened. He wanted to run. The voices in the tank continued to shout, higher and lower. The grey liquid was flowing faster, pouring into the black tanks. Armitage realized that each of the voice barrels was connected to some kind of sound amplifier. Who would want to study the vocal capabilities of these lungs, and why? Behind him, sound diagrams of screams with mathematical functions appeared on the monitors. He turned to the door and realized he wasn't alone. Some of the squad had grabbed the equipment they needed and entered the elevator leading to the docking bay, leaving the missing behind. One of the fighters, named Austin, was coughing non-stop. The other, Grilly, clutched his stomach and bent over with a soft wheeze. The mechanic felt sick and threw up. Something was pouring out of his eyes and nose. He could barely breathe. His chest was noisy. His skin was visibly green, glistening with a thin, oily patina of sweat. After a moment, he dropped to his knees and lowered his head almost to the ground. When they arrived back at the barge, 2 more members of the squad were coughing violently. They had gotten worse in the infirmary. Vezik, a member of the Star Destroyer expedition, slipped off his bunk. His face became almost transparent with pallor and his eyes rolled back. His whole body twitched and shook as if under the influence of high-voltage discharges. Then he fell onto his back, opened his mouth and made an incomprehensible noise. A thick stream of scarlet blood spurted from his mouth toward the ceiling. The head of medical service, Zahara Cody, ordered all those who had returned from the disruptor to be quarantined in the isolation ward. But it was too late. All the prisoners and all the guards on the prison barge began to fall ill, and soon the entire infirmary was filled with sick people. They were even lying on the floor. The room was filled with the sounds of their coughing, smoking, monitors buzzing, and constant cries for help. Whatever the search party had brought in from the Star Destroyer had spread so quickly throughout Purgatory that Zahara and 21B, the surgical droid nicknamed Waste, had lost count of the incoming patients. Healing was out of the question. Zahara was unable to make a diagnosis. The symptoms varied by race. There were complaints of upper respiratory congestion, fever, indigestion, seizures, hallucinations, bleeding, and comas. The medical droid had extensive programs to combat infectious diseases, but the strain of the unknown virus did not resemble any disease, and the robot was unable to isolate the molecular component of the strain. In his opinion, individual cells did not exhibit their infectious properties until their numbers reached a level the body could no longer handle. Until it's too late. Zahara and Waste's conversation was interrupted by an alarm. Another patient, number 13, had died, then another died, and another. The patients were dying faster and faster before the doctor's eyes. The Purgatory guards, clad in protective suits and masks, were also falling ill, their lungs filled with bloody fluid, the disease killed indiscriminately. Prisoners, guards, wardens, stormtroopers. If the prisoners had 2 bodies, the smaller one was already dead and limp, and the other was rocking it in his arms like a baby, crying and trying to revive it. Somewhere 2 Imperial stormtroopers sat, their bodies frozen over the Dejarik board, waiting to be moved. The corpses of the first and second pilots sat at the Purgatory pilot station, reclining in their chairs, mouths open, grey flesh sagging from their bones. Wookiees were affected differently by the disease. Their tongues swelled and hung from their mouths like ugly, overripe fruit. Their throats were torn open, dark red muscles were exposed. The control system ran a bioscan of the ship. At the end of the day, 6 of the original 522 administrative security personnel and prisoners remained. Only 6 were unaffected by the disease on Purgatory. Chief Medical Officer Zahara Cody, Chief of Security Sartoris, and 2 brothers of prisoners, Trig and Kale. 2 other particularly dangerous criminals were in solitary confinement on the lower levels of Purgatory at the time of the outbreak. A Wookiee named Chewbacca and a certain Han Solo, The medical droid, Trash, was able to isolate the immunity gene from Zahara Cody's blood, then synthesize it artificially, creating an antivirus that Zahara injected into Han and Chewbacca, saving them from the virus that wiped out 99.7% of the prison barge's population. But if Han had no side effects after the antivirus injection, Zahara realized from Chewbacca's example that it behaves differently in different races. The Wookiee began to feel differently in a few moments. In the Wookiee's mind, the disease sang its bloody, violent song. Before that, a tumor swelled in his throat. The antivirus seemed to have affected the Wookiee's hormones, causing a cacophony of childish screams and calls for murder to reign in his head, as if materializing into the ghostly essence of the disease. Fortunately, the rampage was quickly stopped by the oxygen deprivation it caused. Chewbacca collapsed to the ground, and while he was unable to resist, Zahara was able to identify the swelling in his neck and pump out the grayish-pink liquid that filled it. Soon, the Chewie's consciousness cleared. When he finally came to, the three decided to leave the cell, but on the way to the turbolifts, something strange happened. As Zahara walked down the dark corridors to Chewbacca and Han's cells, the floor was literally littered with dead guards. Now there were no bodies. The turbolift took them to the upper levels of the ship, to the infirmary. When the doors opened, Zahara was shocked again. She remembered the corridor littered with the bodies of guards and stormtroopers who hadn't made it to the infirmary. There had been dozens. Back then, the bodies had been piled on top of each other in puddles of vomit. Now they were all gone. The three of them walked down the empty corridors to the infirmary. All the beds were empty. There were no bodies anywhere. Only under one bunk did Zahara see a severed human arm. The bones of the forearm had been shattered by a heavy, blunt object. 2 fingers were missing, torn out with the knuckles. 2-1B lay torn to pieces on the floor behind the last bunk. His arms, legs, and head had been ripped off and smashed, and his chest was so damaged that the instrument panel was glowing randomly under the protective cover. The droid was still trying to say something, making nonsensical noises. Then, in a terrifyingly clear voice, he spoke, "They're awake!" Inside him, something clicked again this time, with a rattle and a snap, and when the droid spoke, his voice was thick and slow. "They are eating." A short time later, in the corridor leading to the escape pods on the other side, Zahara, Han, and Chewie encountered 2 young brothers, Trig and Kale. The encounter didn't go well and almost led to a shootout, but soon their common goal of survival forced them to team up. The pod was locked with a sealed door. It could only be opened from the pilot station. The brothers stayed by the capsule while the rest of the crew went to the control room. An alarm went off in the corridor, and the older brother, Kale, went to check it out and told Trig to wait by the capsule. Just then, something flashed in the capsule. Trig recoiled. His whole body was frozen with surprise. His legs barely moved, struggling to hold on. Nerve endings felt like they had been replaced with hot copper wire. His heart beat so fast it rattled in his throat. He held his breath and listened. Something was scratching softly inside the capsule. Trig squeezed the comlink so hard his fingers almost cramped. He picked it up and flipped the switch. "Dr. Cody? Trig? Yeah? We're on the bridge. We're trying to disengage the capsule's door lock. We won't have long to wait." "Hold on. There's something in the capsule." "What is it?" "I don't know yet. It's scraping." "Trig, wait. Trig, I checked the entire barge with the bioscanner, and there's nothing in the pod." Trig stared at the hatch, the sounds from which had already become frantic. Along with them was heard something new, a wet, mousing, toothy sound. It was as if someone inside the capsule was chewing its way out. "That's it. Found the opening code." "No. Wait, don't." There was a click and the hatch door slid upward. When Kale returned, Trig was gone. The hatch door was open. Kale ducked down and crawled inside. His brother wasn't inside either. A horrible, strong, stinky, festering odor filled the capsule. The capsule was more like a predator's den where the bones of the last of their prey had been gnawed off. His brother had literally fallen over Kale's head from the technical shaft. Trig was screaming, waving his fists, scratching, clawing, kicking and panting, and he was crying, making him seem much younger than his age. Kale tried to comfort his younger brother and hugged him. Then he noticed that all of Trig's clothes were tattered. It was as if some beast had attacked him. The collar had been torn off, exposing his lean, bare chest. one sleeve torn off, revealing a thin arm. The scraps of cheap fabric were wet and sticky in places, like the inside of an escape pod. Cale hugged his brother even tighter and pulled him against his chest. He didn't let go until he felt him stop kicking and the frightened tiredness in his movements. And he didn't let go until Trig had calmed down completely, except for the intermittent breathing. "It's okay." Cale stepped back a little to look into Trig's face. "What's wrong?" But Trig just stared at him with reddened eyes. He was so pale that his skin seemed transparent. His face was frozen, except for a slight tremor in his chin. "Did someone attack you? From the capsule? From in there?" He waited for Trig to understand his questions and answer, but his brother remained silent. The longer he looked at Cale, the more he wondered. Did he see him at all? He hugged his brother again. Meanwhile, in the pilot station, Tysa, the ship's artificial intelligence, alerted Dr. Zahara Cody that she had detected a new life form on the ship, then displayed a virtual model of purgatory on an electronic panel. Tiny flashing red dots appeared in the volumetric multidimensional image of the ship. They moved together, clustered and friendly, from the lower prison blocks, traversing level after level on their way to the administrative area. The hologram made it appear as if they were running in an insect-like avalanche, at a speed uncharacteristic of such large creatures. They climbed up shafts, ventilation ducts, technical shafts. Then she heard them coming. It was a deafening, thunderous noise, hungry and angry, merging into a solid wall of inhuman rumbling. Her blood froze in her veins. Zahara looked in the direction of the docking shaft. As she turned to see Han and Chewbacca screaming to get out of here, she saw Cale Longo burst through the half-open hatch of the administrative level with his younger brother in his arms. "Run!" Cale shouted. He was running himself, desperately, his feet barely touching the ground. His head was like a hinge, twisting in every direction, his eyes wide with terror. Trig was twisted in his arms, his whole body pressed against his brother. Zahara had never seen a more terrified creature in all her life. The path to the last capsule was cut off. All 5 of them rushed to the docking bay that connected Purgatory to the Star Destroyer. Cale jumped into the docking tower with Trig in his arms. Dr. Cody jumped in behind him. She turned around. Han Solo and Chewbacca were still running around the pilot station. The Wookiee was shooting at anything that came near them. Cale couldn't see what it was. He really didn't want to. He'd heard it, and that was enough. Then Trig, the youngest of the brothers, yelled, "Father, it's him!" He saw his father, who had been beaten to death by the head of security, Sartoris, just a few days before. Cale lunged at his brother. He reached out and grabbed Trig's pant leg, wrapping his fingers around his ankle. With a thud, Trig fell to the ground. Cale grabbed Trig's belt with his other hand and pulled him back down the shaft. Then Cale looked up and saw his father too. He was surrounded by the dead, prisoners and guards. His dead yellow skin was covered in 2-week-old rot. His skull was hideously swollen and partially split on one side. Cale could clearly see his lower jaw dangling. He couldn't move. For a few moments it seemed like an eternity. He watched his father waddle toward him in a terrible, awkward gait, his face glowing with familiar anticipation. Finally, Cale snapped out of his daze and cried out. As he stood and ran back to the mine, he saw Solo and the Wookiee dragging Trig inside, but they looked over his head into the hallway where the loud noise was coming from. As if in a dream, he saw Dr. Cody's face go pale with fear. Cale saw her cover Trig's eyes with the palm of her hand. Then he felt his leg grabbed. He didn't even hear his own scream. He only woke up on the landing deck of the Star Destroyer. Dr. Cody was sitting next to him, wrapping his bloody leg in cloth. They had broken through. It was only now that Cale realized that the bodies from the prison barge had come to life, and that his father was among them. His father had bitten him. The saliva had taken on a kind of coppery taste. Cale leaned forward, opened his mouth, but he didn't vomit. His stomach contracted as if it resisted dying. His diaphragm twitched and relaxed with the nasty insistence of a muscle spasm. The survivors were safe for now, but the gnashing of claws and teeth, the roar of the infernal mob, was already reaching the destroyer's hangar. The dead looked up from the barge still docked to the huge Imperial ship. Cale tried to stand and lean on his sore leg. The pain cut like a knife. With a soft exclamation that sounded like a groan, Cale fell to the ground and looked to see what was wrong with his leg. Blood spurted from the wound, spilled onto the tourniquet and turned dark. He couldn't walk. Kale had to lie down so he wouldn't bleed to death. Dr. Cody stayed with him while Han, Chewbacca and Trig went to the captain's bridge, where the control center of the Star Destroyer was located. Undocking from the Purgatory was their only chance to escape. They walked silently through the hangar. Han went first. His phaser dangled at his side. He and Chewbacca seemed to know where to go. Trig followed sleepily. Silence hung over them like a black cloud. The only sound was footsteps and the echo of those footsteps from the spacious steel floor and the creak of the Star Destroyer in the black vacuum of space. There were no other sounds at all, which only emphasized the size of the ship and the infinity of the void surrounding it. In the hangar where Kale and Zahara remained, the approaching screams of the Horde intensified. Kale begged for the doctor to cut off his leg. It didn't hurt, the feeling was different. He could feel the sickness creeping up his body. Kale tore off the bloody bandages one by one. The calf was missing a piece of flesh the size of his fist. Bare tibia peeked through torn muscle and blood vessels. The damaged flesh around the wound had turned grey. A grey shadow ran up his leg past his knee to his thigh, throbbing and covered in a jelly-like film. It was as if some hand under the boy's skin was getting closer and closer to his chest. "Take it away, cut it off, throw it away, remove them." Zachary felt as if time had stopped. She suddenly remembered what one of her teachers had told her in class. The day will come when you will be faced with a situation for which you are completely unprepared, both physically and emotionally. That's when you'll find out what kind of doctor you are, how fearful you are, and how well you've trained. She jerked open her pants pocket and pulled out a medical kit. Inside were scalpels, gauze, and bandages, the simplest of medical supplies. Kale continued to yell. The grey, throbbing tumor was moving past his waist, climbing up his stomach, turning his pink skin into a colorless, speckled mass. Zachary almost threw up. It was like meat rotting from the inside out. "He's dying or worse. Don't delay." Her own sobering voice sounded in her head. Taking a scalpel from the kit, Zahara touched the sharpened end to the bare flesh just below her navel. For a moment, Kale's screams turned into squeals of pain. He stared at her hands as she widened the incision, working her fingers through the layer of subcutaneous fat to the contracted abdominal muscles. Cold sweat broke out on her upper lip and forehead. Muscle veins slid between her fingers like taut, wet strands of yarn. The thing was cutting its winding way up Kale's body. With her fingertips, she felt a slight stirring and squeezed her hand. Something suddenly twitched and spurted out at her from her armpit layer. Thick, slimy, pearlescent pus enveloped her hands. The screams from the mine became simply deafening. Zahara pulled her hands away and watched as the murky liquid first thickened, then twitched and finally wrapped itself like gloves around her hands, looking for open wounds through which to get in. The more of it that was in the air, the more it stank all around. Zahara wiped her hands on her pants, with difficulty holding back the urge to vomit and repeating to herself that if she gave in to weakness now, she'd never get her will together again. Kale's face turned pale and grey. The boy stared at her unblinking in shock. Zahara hoped he would pass out. So far that hadn't happened, but at least he'd stopped yelling. "I'm going to have to get you inside. I have to make sure I've removed everything." Before he could answer, she slipped her hand into the slit, moved it there, expecting the twitching slime to pounce on her fingers again. But she felt nothing. Lowering her eyes, she saw that the grey-black color of putrefaction remained just so over the ruler of her waist, but had not progressed any further. "I think I got it." She took a deep breath and shifted her gaze to Kale. He was still unconscious. His eyes closed and slumped to his side. Zahara picked up his torn shirt, folded it and pressed it against the wound to stop the bleeding. She pressed down on the tourniquet, breathing heavily, wishing her heart would slow to a normal beat. She didn't know if she had helped more or hurt more, but Kale was still alive and breathing. Had she done nothing, the outcome could have been very different. A little later, when she had calmed down a bit, Zahara noticed that things had quieted down in the docking shaft next to them. The screaming had stopped. And then she heard another sound from somewhere far away, an indistinct answering growl. Something at the other end of the Star Destroyer was already shouting back. Han, Chewie and Trig walked down the hallways until they came upon a stack of boxes blocking the way, 20 or 30 of them. Chewie stepped closer and read the inscription, Imperial Biological Service. The boxes contained red and black colored cylinders. One of the red cylinders had its shut-off valve torn off, and the container itself was empty. The surge inside the black cylinder that Chewbacca had taken was cyclical, as if something was living a life of its own in there. Like it was beating inside the black cylinders and running down the inner walls trying to get out, something alive. Wookiee had the sharpest hearing of the three of them, and he could have sworn he heard hissing. Chewbacca saw the boy open his mouth in fear. The lights flickered on. The Wookiee heard the creak and crack of metal, failing to support the weight of an unknown entity approaching them. The ceiling shuddered, sagged, and opened. Through the hole, Chewbacca discerned a solid mass of black-eyed faces, arms and legs that was already making its way out. Some wore the uniforms of Imperial servants, on others the armor of stormtroopers. A knee pad here, a shoulder pad there, or a broken helmet. It wasn't until later that he realized how many there really were, maybe hundreds, maybe more. An army of the dead, and they were reaching for him, reaching for the boy. Chewie never realized who shot first. One of them, he or Han or both, fired a line of blaster fire simultaneously at the mass of swarming intertwined bodies. And then it didn't matter. Some important structural element of the ceiling rattled sharply as if a hole had opened between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Bodies fell in an avalanche of stinking yellow flesh and broken armor, grasping hands and screaming mouths. Some landed on their feet, some on all four limbs, and stayed that way as the animals lifted their heads up and grinned, baring their teeth. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and disgustingly hungry. The crowd melted away as if they hadn't expected the gunfire. Chewie pelted them with unaimed fire, and the helmets of their armor shattered, revealing swollen, half-decayed faces with the same expression of angry malice. Khan, standing by his side, shouted something, but nothing could be heard over the noise of gunfire. The corridor ahead filled with smoke. Somewhere far away, as if on the other side of space, Wookiee felt Trigg's fingers clutching at his arm, clinging to life, and the creatures kept coming, either jumping or falling down new corpses on top of old ones. Chewie realized it was useless to water them down with his blaster. They would still be arriving. He roared loudly. Han pointed to another hatch at the end of the corridor. Grabbing the boy in an armful, Chewie turned around, rushed over there, and without looking back, dived through the hatch. A moment later, Han dived in after him as well. Slamming the console from the inside, closed the door, and fired the control panel. Chewbacca could already hear the backside screaming and pouncing on the door. Glancing over to Han, Chewbacca noticed something on his face that he hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine fear. For a moment, Han was so pale that the scar on his chin stood out especially. It was as if he had aged 20 years. Han opened his mouth, but something hit the hatch on the other side with unthinkable force and weight. It was as if their inevitable future, however brief, had just appeared on the other side of the door with a mouthful of gleaming yellow teeth, and they fled. Zahara, fighting for Kale's life, heard gunshots. They were followed by the inhuman roar of dead mouths. A wave of creatures moving in defiance of the laws of creation washed over them. The doctor dragged the half-conscious boy behind her. Adrenaline spilled through the blood vessels, bursting from beneath the base of his skull. Her feet were already running on their own, pounding the floor at breakneck speed. The echo of footsteps merged into a single sound. The creatures were clearly not keeping up. They tried to run, but they couldn't keep up with Zahara. She was moving faster than them, even skinny-dipping Kale behind her. There was another metallic sound. Kale suddenly jerked in her arms and fell silent. Zahara stopped and felt the warm wetness on her body and legs. Everything below her waist was covered in blood. She lowered her eyes. The right half of Kale's face was gone, reduced to a pulp. The fractured skull protruded beneath the skype like shattered terracotta. The lower jaw hung crookedly at the joint. Kale had been hit by a shot that could have ripped Zahara's stomach open. The boy's uninjured eye rolled out and became clouded. Zahara could already smell the disgusting sweet odor of burnt skin and hair. Kale's head hung down. Zahara saw that the left side of his face was completely intact, save for a red blob under his eye. Someone gave a low growl and she raised her head again. The creatures were already moving faster, attracted by the fresh blood. Zahara dropped the corpse and ran. Prison guard Captain Sartoris, who flew off the barge in an escape pod, woke up after hours of blacking out. The capsule had crashed in the hangars of a star destroyer, caught in the massive ship's tractor beam. As he climbed out, he saw a wave of the dead coming at him. They surrounded him. There was no escape route out of the hangar, but the hangar was equipped with X-Wings and TIE fighters. He jumped into the cockpit of the cross-wing and opened fire. Each shot swept away the dead, giving him seconds to escape. The horde drove him toward the shuttle, and he jumped through the hatch. He collapsed to the floor, then opened his eyes and saw several pairs of eyes scrutinizing him. When his vision returned to normal, he realized he was looking at several men in Imperial uniforms that were not their size. The men leaned over him from chairs attached to the walls on either side of the cabin. Sartoris's reaction was instantaneous. He recoiled and tried to crawl away, but to no avail. "It's okay," said the voice. "We're not infected." Their haggard and emaciated faces looked more like skulls covered in parchment. The yellow skin was tight around the bones, lips curled in a perpetual smirk. The cheekbones protruded deliberately. Sartoris thought one of them tried to smile. "I'm Commander Forrester." His voice was cut short by the sound of explosions outside. The blaster fire continued on the other side of the ship's plating, punches and slaps against the armored hull. The commander waved his hand and didn't even look in that direction. "Soon they will stop. They're the ones who are reflexive." "Reflexively?" Uh-huh. Some learned behaviors, even highly ineffective ones, are hard to get rid of. Forrester, not paying much attention to the blaster fire on the other side of the Bang's plating, explained that it had all started 10 weeks ago when the first tanks had leaked. There was a conspiracy theory buff on the crew who thought the leak was no accident and all part of some Imperial grand experiment. "Wait, start from the beginning." The commander paused, and Sartoris noticed that the skeletons sitting on the sides leaned forward and began to listen intently, as if they had never heard the story, though they had gone through everything themselves. "It doesn't matter now. On Miglubin, we received a secret cargo of experimental artillery ammunition for the Empire. The whole thing by personal order of Lord Vader himself. The destination was a test base on Hive 7 outside the Brunette system, but we didn't even make it to the middle ring. At first, the breach appeared to be minor. Engineers patched it up. Some scientists were even able to study its effects on human psychology, the lungs, and especially the larynx. We thought they had it locked up securely, but that didn't last long. The contagion quickly spread throughout Star Destroyer. Soon, no one was safe anymore." "Just a second," interrupted Sartoris. "You're telling me there are 10,000 more of these ghosts roaming around out there?" "No, of course not. Some of us managed to escape. At least they tried. Some showed signs of natural immunity. From their blood, our doctors synthesized an antivirus. I'm guessing yours did the same while you were still here." Sartoris just muttered something, not wanting to mention his sudden resistance to the disease. Forrester didn't notice anything. "We've isolated an entire section of the ship and injected ourselves with antivirus. At first, everyone thought it was enough, but there wasn't enough for all of us. There was still a supply of antivirus in the biolab, but we couldn't get in. That's when plans began to change. Obviously, many of the crew were eaten before they could turn. Torn apart and, well, digested without a trace." Forrester swallowed, finding this part of his story particularly nasty. "First, we collected the remains. We took them to the dump, ground them up, thinking that way they wouldn't change. In the end, there were only a few of us left to run." He glanced coldly and inexpressively at Sartoris. "Until they figured out how to turn on the capture beam. Can they think?" Sartoris remembered the screaming creatures limping around the ship, firing their blasters in all directions haphazardly. "This is crazy." "Yes, it's really crazy," Forrester agreed, looking at him without any curiosity. "I just know they were waiting for us inside the hangar when we got back. The one in front had his head blown off at the shoulders." He licked his lips. "After that, we isolated ourselves inside. We sent out an alarm and lay in wait." "How long have you been here?" 10 weeks. Sartoris felt his mouth open on its own beyond his will. "You mean you've been marinating here for 10 weeks? At first there were 30 of us. Now there's only 7 of us left, including me. We're trying to communicate, but all frequencies are jammed. It seems to be a deliberate countermeasure on their part." When he shifted his gaze back to Sartoris, his eyes were colorless and impassive. The eyes of a man giving a lecture rehearsed years ago. "Did you ask how they managed to activate the tractor beam? Well, they learn. It's inherent in them. These things are inherently learning, but they're like animals. That's first. Consider this, those who changed aboard the destroyer 10 weeks ago are no longer firing blasters at the Durol steel armor of the shuttle. They've already learned it doesn't work. These are the new additions, prisoners and guards, that's who's shooting at us. And if you listen, you'll hear that they've gone quiet. He snapped his frail fingers. That's how quickly their behavior changes. Sartoris realized Forrester was telling the truth. The phaser fire outside the shuttle had subsided, just as Forrester had predicted. It seems to have something to do with the disease, with what it was originally intended for. They huddle together in groups, tribes, swarms, and communicate with each other. I'm sure you've heard that too. They adapt all at the same time, all as one. It's like a systemic upgrade, don't you think? Sartoris shook his head. What did you mean when you said the disease was meant for something? Are you saying that the virus was created on purpose? That's naive, he said. I told you that we have brought top-secret weapons on board. Something began to bother Sartoris. Over the course of the conversation, the soldiers had slowly approached him, licking their lips over and over again. Sartoris crawled away from them. The first thing he noticed was a pile of neatly folded military uniforms on a chair in the corner. What happened to the others? You have to understand, there's plenty of water on the shuttle, but not much food. It's just a matter of survival. We were starving, you know? Wait, we're not like them. Of course you are. We drew lots. Everyone died quickly and painlessly. First we dumped the surplus over there. He pointed to the escape hatch. We threw it to those creatures as if it would satisfy their hunger. But it made them come back, so we ate the rest as well. In the end, we even sucked the brains out of the bones. But none of my men felt any pain, that's my guarantee. An emaciated hand slipped into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a small leather patch. You won't feel anything either. What's this here? Nabutal is a paralytic. You will simply fall asleep, and when we're rescued, the Emperor will honor your deed. Sartoris wanted to say something else. He remembered that the commander had said there were 6 of them, but he had only seen 4. They grabbed him and put his hands behind his back. Zahara couldn't remember how long she'd been running. Stacks of crates were blocking the way forward. She went straight toward them. At the hatch on her left, she saw a sign. Biolab 242, no unauthorized personnel allowed. Inside the lab, she found a cell with 2 yellowed corpses hanging from it. Wires, power tubes, and monitoring equipment were hanging down to them from the ceiling, a pair of sinister puppets. Both were badly decomposed, their faces unrecognizable, the eye sockets were empty. One of the corpses raised its head. The creature on the other side of the glass lifted its deformed, grinning face, twitching its rotted leg stumps, rocking back and forth. The second corpse came to life as well. His face twitched as if he could smell her with the remnants of his nose. Zahara flinched, and the corpse lifted one shredded arm and grabbed at the wires and tubes holding it to the ceiling. Sensing that it was still there, both bodies launched themselves into a jerky, swaying dance. They collided, swayed forward, and stretched their arms back and forth higher and higher. Some of the sensor wires had long since come loose, but one tube connected directly to the chests of both of them was still in place. The grey liquid that oozed from the tube reminded Zahara of the substance she had tried to siphon from Kale Long's abdomen. She followed the tube with her eyes and found that it was connected to the black tanks. They were collecting this slurry, Zahara thought. That's what this is all about. Their bodies were secreting this stuff. She heard someone's footsteps behind her. Glass rattled under someone's foot. With a shriek of fear, she turned around. One of the corpses being examined had managed to hit the glass, leaving a red stain. She watched as it swung backwards, still attached to its sensors, and the other swung forward, hitting the glass hard with its face and arms. Then back again. She felt something move behind her. From behind her shoulder, she smelled the acrid odor of decomposition, like from a grave. She turned around, and something grabbed her. Zahara looked the creature straight in the face. The disease had not yet disfigured the researcher's face as much as those corpses in the cell. She could still guess what some of the features looked like before the infection. Grey hair, eagle nose, deep wrinkles on his face, a man of science. He wore a blood-stained lab coat with the sleeve torn off at the brush. With a quiet snap, he opened his mouth and lunged at her. She jabbed the syringe directly into its eye, and with the other, she jabbed the side of its head, pressing both pistons simultaneously. The creature froze with its mouth wide open and screamed. The corpse's legs buckled and the body slumped to the floor. As the corpse twitched on the floor, Zahara rushed for the exit. She was almost there when the screaming stopped and she heard a hoarse voice behind her. "FG." The creature tried to speak. Zahara turned around, hating herself. The creature in the lab coat was crawling blindly toward her with syringes sticking out of its head. The antivirus injections had restored the remnants of human senses, which was enough for the corpse to try to make contact. Its mouth opened and closed. It babbled something unintelligible, but she couldn't translate these pathetic attempts at human speech. The creature raised one hand pleadingly. The corpse was doing something, trying to tell her. "What happened?" Zahara asked. "What did you do?" The creature in the lab coat began to squeeze out some viscous sounds, but faster already. Its face was convulsing. The corpse reached for the console behind Zahara. "Trevovus!" What? The creature rumbled again with fervor, swung its arms and scrambled down. It growled and pounded its fists on the floor. Its fingers stretched and twitched. Zahara thought the corpse was imitating the writing process. With great difficulty, the creature reached over, pulled one of the syringes out of its eye. It slammed it against the durasteel floor and began to swipe it back and forth, making some kind of sign. With a sharp, desperate squeak, the tip of the needle dug into the reinforced flooring. The needle broke and the creature sat up, not so weak anymore, but very human-like. The corpse smiled at Zahara. She figured the antivirus should have kicked in by now anyway. She looked around at the scratches on the floor. The uneven letters looked more like encephalograms. While she was pondering what was depicted there, a creature in a robe threw itself at her and dwarfed her. She screamed. The creature closed both hands around her throat. Cold fingers slid, squeezing, pinching, choking her screams. The creature's mouth was already approaching her throat. Zahara tried to push it away, but she might as well have tried to remove the steel handcuffs. The more she struggled, the tighter the grip. She began to lose consciousness. What had they told her in the lectures about lack of oxygen? First the muscles shut down, then the brain. She could already feel the heavy darkness enveloping her eyes, and her hearing was fading. A strange indifference and complete numbness came. It ended with the metallic crack of durasteel against bone. A cold, stinking slurry spread through his hair. The grip on his throat suddenly loosened. The dead arms went limp and spread apart. Zahara lifted her head, her eyes cleared. The creature's head was twisted to the side, a surgical bone saw protruding from its neck, halfway into the grey flesh. Which one? Behind her she saw a flat metal face and still couldn't believe her eyes. "Waste, you're back. I'm sorry." 21B just looked at her. "You saved me?" Yeah, sure." The surgeon droid agreed, somewhat puzzled, apparently remembering that he was sawing off the head of a creature in a lab coat. He tossed the saw and the corpse aside on the floor. "That creature tried to hurt you. According to the program laid down at the Academy on Renal, my primary concern is to protect the life and welfare of the living as best I can. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "You can. Tell me about the research that's been done here." "I'm afraid I don't know much. Scientifically, I know that the scientists who programmed me were working on a simple chemical way to reduce the rate of decomposition of living tissue. Ideally, the virus could possess nerve receptors and make muscles work even after clinical death." Zahara remembered the corpses yelling at each other and huddling together in an organized army. Were these developments commissioned by the military? It's hard to say. All information was classified. After all, I'm a scientific and surgical droid, not interested in such things, nor am I particularly aware of covert military operations. The new shot that struck the hull of the Imperial boarding shuttle was not fired from a handheld weapon. Sartoris realized it only when the ship was thrown up and sideways, and he flew away from the soldiers advancing on him from the cockpit. It hit Forrester. X-wing laser cannon. Those things outside, they saw me shoot it. I guess Forrester was right, they're learning. Sartoris grabbed the gaunt Forrester and opened the shuttle's locking mechanism and threw the captain outside. A crowd of dead men surrounded the ship on all sides. It was a sea of hungry faces, prisoners, guards, the ship's crew. Just as Sartoris had expected, one of them had already climbed into the crucible next to the shuttle and was fumbling haphazardly with the control panel. Sartoris reached down and grabbed one more soldier and threw him into the crowd. The creatures instantly pounced on the unfortunate man and grabbed him by his arms, legs, and head, still alive, ripped him apart. Despite the urge to look away, Sartoris caught the expression on the man's face. stretched out in a silent scream as one of the dead men ripped his arm from his shoulder joint. The dead man standing next to him bit off the second arm and began swinging it like a club. Sartoris dived in and grabbed another one with some kind of weapon in his hand, either a club or a knife. And this one the captain threw outward, almost without thinking, but rather obeying the action of adrenaline in his blood. Behind him stood a third, Sartoris, and he was grabbed under the arm and by the skinny shin. He pushed him out onto the hull of the ship. The emaciated soldier gawked helplessly at him. "Please don't," he suddenly begged. There was something in his voice that made Sartoris stop and look him straight in the face. Beneath the filth, hunger, and exhaustion, he saw a teenage boy who had been put into the service of the Empire. The only result of such service was death. "Don't!" Sartoris looked outside at the soulless creatures shuffling their feet and saw them tearing apart the bodies he had left behind, flailing their torn limbs, fighting over the last scraps. Then his gaze shifted back to the soldier. The haggard face, the terrified eyes. The boy looked at the creatures as well. He seemed to faint from the inhuman terror. Sartoris could hear the air whistling in his throat, in his empty lungs. "What's your name? Sir, what? Your name? Your parents called you something?" "White." "Is the ship still white? Shuttle? Well, yes, but a tractor beam." "That's my problem. I'll be back, and when I get back, so will you and your comrades. Do you understand me, White?" "Yes, sir." "I'll be there, and I suggest you take this opportunity to lock yourself in the ship as securely as possible." He raised his arms to climb onto the platform, but immediately noticed a bloody wound just below his right elbow. Then he realized he had been bitten. Han and Chewbacca entered the bridge. In the pit below them, the creatures opened indiscriminate blaster fire. There might have been thousands of them, but it was impossible to see in the darkness. They fired poorly at first, then better and better. Sometimes the shots flew so close that they could smell the ozone. Han brought himself back to reality with an effort of will. He and Chewie were on the command bridge. Computer modules and navigational instruments were scattered for kilometers around like some miracle of interstellar devastation. Everything was smashed beyond recognition. Screens stood perforated. Wiring and sensors burned, mangled, or ripped completely out of their mounts. Many of them lay on the floor as if someone's terribly heavy boots had stomped on them. Each step was accompanied by the squashed crunch of shattered glass. Han sighed and brushed the debris off the chair standing by the one not-so-damaged work terminal. "Looks like only the capture beam is working. What kind of encryption system is this?" He pressed a few keys on the working keyboard. Something chirped in the console, and the cracked monitor displayed first transparent and then bright lines of navigation codes. The huge destroyer shifted slightly on its axis. Khan, who had never flown such huge craft in his life, suddenly burst into laughter. What would the Empire's top strategists think when they saw a lousy smuggler with a bounty on his head sitting at the controls of a star destroyer? The entire ship shuddered. Han jumped up in his chair, trying to figure out what he'd done and how to fix it. It looked like the destroyer was slowly lurching to the side. One of the consoles buzzed low but steady. Lines of text ran across the shattered monitor. Chewbacca crouched in the semi-darkness, staring at something. When he stood up in his arms, Han saw a small, furry body. Another Wookiee, Han understood. Very small. The cub was dressed in a tattered prison robe. The little Wookiee mewled weakly. Chewbacca shifted his gaze to him, then to Han. Squatting in the corner were 3 more Wookiees in prison robes huddled together, splashing in a whole ocean of blood. Han could see bits of meat on their faces. The Wookiees snorted and breathed heavily as they tore apart the human body before them. The corpses they were eating were all wearing the uniforms of Imperial guards. They raised their heads sharply. It was instantaneous. A clump of bloody fur and hot scythe-covered muscles rushed toward him faster than he could see. Reflexes kicked in, and Han fired at the nearest Wookiee. The direct hit tore through his chest. The Wookiee lay sprawled on the floor next to the human corpse, panting, coughing, trying to get up. The other Wookiee behind the first fell to his side, trying to get up, and the third stumbled over him. Han shot him in the face, and he fell backwards. Then he shot the one the third one tripped over. He shot until the one he had tripped over was an incomprehensible pile of quivering fur. Han drew back and felt small hands grab his neck. He turned around and saw that the baby Wookiee was already baring its teeth at him. Han tried to push it away, but it clawed at him with its arms and legs, fiercely squirming its hot body like a big rat. There was a deafening explosion nearby, and the baby Wookiee's head exploded into pieces. As he slumped to the floor, Han saw Chewbacca lower his blaster. Trig ran, and behind him ran a creature wearing a stormtrooper helmet. The helmet was too big for her. In that instant, he could only stare at the face that showed from beneath the helmet, at the crooked grin of his brother, half of whose face was mangled beyond recognition, at the glistening hollow and shattered bones. The creature lunged forward, pinning him against the opening of the shaft. Trig opened his mouth to say something, but only cried. This time he no longer held back the tears, the snot, the sobs, the howls. Why not? What did it matter now? Kale opened and closed his mouth, and Trig could smell death. The very death his brother had endured, and to which his brother would now condemn him. Kale wasn't going to answer him, and he wasn't going to stop. Trig loved his brother more than anyone else in the galaxy, but that didn't matter now. The creature roared, lowered its face to Trig's neck, and ran its teeth and tongue along his throat. Its hot breath smelled like a disgusting, poisonous swamp. Kale's hands were both hot and cold. The dead flesh was wet, sticky, and gummy. With a cry of pain, Trig pushed the creature back. A hot, white flash of something hitherto unknown swept through his stomach and stopped near his heart. It was like a light went out inside, followed by the sad realization of what was about to happen. It was like a story he'd already heard somewhere, with an ending that had already been written in how he could change anything. When Kale lunged at him again already with redoubled fury, Trig straightened his knee under the carcass and kicked it upward, instantly lifting his brother above him. Throwing Kale aside, Trig rolled over, grabbed his brother's wrists and pushed him to the edge of the ventilation shaft before pushing him out. Kale fell without a sound. Trig watched him fall, shrinking into a teardrop against the abyss. When he was swallowed up by the semi-darkness and his silhouette was barely recognizable in the faint light of the engine turbine, Trig saw something he hadn't noticed before, faces looking up, thousands of faces. That was the crew of the Star Destroyer. They were all yelling at him with one voice now. In the same instant, Kale's body hit the turbine and bounced off to the side, tumbling through the air and disappearing into the mire of bodies. There was an even louder scream in response, as if a unified entity had awakened and gained a collective mind that had hardly gone beyond the urge to satisfy immediate physical needs. Their breath rose to him in invisible shimmers of hot air. Their hunger seeped through the air like thermal waters rising to the surface before a storm. Blaster shots rang out. No sooner had Trig climbed inside than the ventilation shaft jerked and broke, ripping off the welded fasteners and throwing him outside. He fell out before he could grab onto anything and flew into the void, repeating the path of his older brother. The hard impact on the bridge nearly folded him in half. Pain shot through his legs and ankles. Trig grasped and hung on, his fingers hooked into the cold bars and his body pressed against them. He heard and felt blaster shots whizzing through the space around him. One almost hit. He could only hope the blaster would kill him before he fell into the sea of outstretched arms and open mouths. He really wanted to die before then. Suddenly he felt claw-like fingers scrape and dig into his body. The creature grabbed his leg. Zahara ran from the lab to the hangar control room. It was obvious to her, as to the other survivors, that the only way to escape was to disable the disruptor's capture beam and leave this hell on one of the ships. But when she found a working terminal, the screen alerted her that the beam had already been disabled. Han Chui had succeeded. They made it to the command bridge. But she hesitated and began searching for information about the virus, and the terminal gave her answers. Project Blackwing. Blackwing Imperial's Project A71A to create biological weapons and an algorithm to spread viruses across the galaxies. Top secret. Project status in development. The spreading algorithm, Zahara repeated. She shifted her gaze to the hangar. Bodies were climbing into various ships, crosswings, boarding shuttles, transport frigates, a freighter in the far corner of the hangar. Others climbed into the dilapidated docking shaft that led to the barge. Zahara noticed that they were carrying something on their backs. She looked around at every ship in the hangar and thought again about the propagation algorithm. A controlled means by which the Empire could spread the virus throughout the galaxy if necessary. Absent-mindedly, she watched the group of creatures that had lined up at the side of the crosswing, trying to turn it in their direction. Zahara remembered what the garbage had said about internal communication being the disease's mechanism of operation. They do nothing until they are convinced that they can act together, that the host organism can no longer resist. But why? And then it hit her. They're running away, she said involuntarily out loud. Down there, the crosswing was already looking up, directly at her. A blinding column of fire cut through the hangar bay and headed straight for her. Han saw Trig. The boy had no chance. Even from here, Han could see how it would end if he and Chewie went to the bridge and tried to help him. Just die, all three of them. It was unpleasant to think about, but it was certain and out of the question. Chewie gave a long, sad growl. I know. Han said it with self-loathing, hating himself for saying it out loud. Got a better idea? The boy could have fallen off the bridge at any moment. The creature had a firm grip on his ankle and was pulling him down. He might be able to hold on for 5 seconds at most. Desperately, Han aimed his blaster, knowing that he couldn't fire because at this distance, it would easily hit Trig or just miss. But what else could he do? Chewbacca stared at him, waiting for a decision. Finally, Han nodded and lowered the blaster. Okay, he muttered, just grab him on my signal to come out. Chewie growled again, already shaken, and Han realized what he was looking at. It was too late. The boy had snapped. The boy fell. Trig realized he had landed on some sort of apparatus flying in the void above the main engine turbine, 20 meters above a sea of screaming faces. Trig turned his head and looked ahead. There was a man sitting at the helm. The boy couldn't make out who it was, only that the man was dressed in the uniform of an Imperial prison guard. The platform jerked sideways, describing an arc over the abyss. When the driver looked back, Trig saw the man's face. His presence here was hardly explicable, but after 2.5 months on the prison barge, Trig would recognize Jarrett Sartoris from 1000. Sartoris made a sharp turn and turned the platform toward the far end of the bridge, where Han and Chewie stood watching him with round eyes, much like Trig himself. Are you coming? The guard's voice was more like a hoarse squeak over the screams and blaster shots. Han and Chewie jumped down silently. The platform sagged slightly under their weight. Sartoris pushed the controls forward and up. Trig watched him struggle with the controls and noticed the deep bite on his forearm. The lower tissues had already begun to protrude and wrinkle with a deep, twisted gray numbness. The platform swung to the side, holding them above the crowd, their faces illuminated by frequent flashes of blaster fire. Han and Chewie had already taken up positions on either side, firing back. Where are we going? There's an Imperial shuttle down in the hangar with some soldiers aboard. Ask White down there. And then Sartoris swung over the platform fence and jumped down. Zahara Cody's voice came from the comlink, drowned out by a sea of static, dead men screaming and explosions. The roaring platform with Han, Chewbacca and Trig crashed into the hangar. The hangar was on fire. Trig caught a glimpse of a skinny arm buried under a pile of rubble. She's dead, Han shouted, but the three of them were still alive. The creatures below had stopped screaming and were concentrating on squeezing into the remaining ships. Watching them, Trig realized that priorities were no longer an issue. They also wanted to get off the destroyer as quickly as possible, as did Trig, Han, and Chewie. The landing shuttle Sartoris had mentioned was already in the air. Barely thinking, Trig circled it on the platform. He saw the escape door open. A thin hand waved from the hatch, inviting him inside, and Trig didn't argue. He lifted the platform, put it into hover mode, and climbed onto the railing. The cockpit of the shuttle was dark. The lack of smoke made it easier to breathe. The Imperial soldier standing in front of him was pale, his face haggard, in a way that made Trig uncomfortable. When the soldier smiled, it was as if a thin strip of yellow flesh was stretched over his skull. Then everything shook. The hangar door began to open. Han saw the bottom of the Star Destroyer open up, exposing the cosmic void below. Somewhere to the right, the nose of the Purgatory prison barge flashed. From here it appeared very small, dangling at the end of the docking shaft like a thin bookmark in the vast saga of Imperial supremacy. As the dock opened, the captured ships began to pull out. A pair of TIE fighters, a Freightovie, an Imperial shuttlecraft, and an X-wing spilled out and scattered in all directions like corpse flies. As the small ship flew past them outward, Han noticed the earthy faces of the dead staring out of the portholes. They were crammed in so tightly that the rotted flesh pressed closely against the glass. Han shoved the gaunt Imperial aside and took the pilot's seat. He switched the navigation to manual and lifted the helm up, turning the shuttle around until he could see the open dock below him and open space beyond it. The shuttle hurtled down from the Star Destroyer hangar, whizzed past the prison barge and into the void. There was a thud, and a skinny imp staggered onto the bridge. A dark red fountain of arterial blood gushed from the stump that had once been his arm. His already pale face turned grey, and his mouth opened in astonishment. Something grabbed the soldier and pulled him back. One of the creatures was standing right in the cockpit. It stood there, it smiled. From its teeth dangled pieces of flesh. It lunged at Han. A shot rang out. A moment later, the creature was on the ground, flailing its legs. Chewbacca jumped up, ran to the creature and lifted it in his arms. The hole in its back was still smoking. The Wookiee threw it to the ground with all his might. Trig looked to see where the shot had come from. What he saw was enough to stun him for a moment. Dr. Cody. Zahara stood in the far corner of the compartment, holding Han's blaster in both hands. She spoke softly, almost whispering. "Careful, Chewbacca, I think we'd better shoot him again just to be sure." Khan, still on all fours, crawled backwards, frantically searching for signs of a bite or infection. When he saw Zahara, his eyes widened. "Where did you come from?" She did not answer, but continued to watch the creature in stormtrooper armor. The living Imperial was already convulsing. It was flailing its legs, its head thrown back. Slimy fluid spewed from its mouth. A puddle of slime poured out from under its head. More of the slimy liquid flowed from its nose and ears, and then from the corners of its eyes, like sticky, contagious tears on both sides of its face. "This has never happened to them before," Han remarked. "They had never been this far from the source before." Han looked at them in confusion. "It looks like the remnants of the infection are dissipating through the destroyer from those tanks. That's probably what kept them alive, slowing the decomposition and revitalizing the muscle receptors." "How do you know all this?" "Statistics," she pointed to the other ships that had flown out of the destroyer before them. At first, Han didn't understand what she was referring to, but then he noticed one thing. The ships that had escaped had stopped and were drifting aimlessly in space. "It's a Blackwing flaw," Zahara explained. "It keeps them from spreading further and further." "What is the Blackwing?" The grey liquid in those vials was purified virus. The whole operation was designed to create an unlimited supply of it, probably so the Empire could control them. "So all those zombies down there were just puppets, means to an end?" "Very similar," Zahara nodded. "Their resurrected bodies were supposed to be sources and spreaders, but they didn't work without the constant presence of the virus itself. And then they flew for a long time in silence."